Hi, I'm Gary Zacharias. You're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf, and I appreciate you joining me today. I'm back for, I think, about the fourth look at a book by J. Warner Wallace. He goes by Jim Wallace, but J. Warner Wallace. He's got this first book that he wrote called Cold Case Christianity that was just a home run. Everybody loved it, and he's now got a second edition of it. So you might look for the newer one that's got, I'm guessing about 50 additional pages. And it's subtitled A Homicide Detective Investigates the Claims of the Gospels. So I know I've talked about it before, so I won't spend a lot of time giving the background of it. But I'll just say this. Anything that Wallace writes is worth getting a hold of. His website is coldcasechristianity.com, and there are so many good articles and YouTube videos, all sorts of things that you can take a look at. He's got a graphic novel out now, and I think I did a podcast on that not too long ago. But this is the book that got it all started some years ago. And I wanted to take a look at one of the early chapters. He talks about evidence, types of evidence. Now remember, he's a cold case detective. He's brought a lot of people to trial and got them convicted. And he said when you have evidence in a courtroom situation, it falls into two broad categories. So one is called direct evidence, and that can prove something all by itself. So here's an example. He said in California, jurors are given an example of a witness who saw that it was raining outside. Okay, so jurors are told this. If a witness testifies he saw it raining outside before he came in the courthouse, then that testimony is direct evidence that it was raining. So by itself, if it's trustworthy, then that's enough to prove that it's raining. On the other hand, there's something called circumstantial evidence, sometimes called indirect evidence. It does not prove something on its own, but it points in the right direction by proving something related to the question at hand, is what Jim says. So a lot of people really poo-poo the idea of circumstantial evidence. They don't think it's worth much. But here's how it works. So this related piece of evidence can be considered along with other pieces of circumstantial evidence to see what went on. And Jim says, here's what jurors in California instructed. So remember the story about the rain. So he says, if a witness testifies that he saw someone come inside wearing a raincoat and it had water on it, that testimony is circumstantial because it may support a conclusion that it was raining. And of course, pretty obviously, the more pieces of consistent circumstantial evidence that you can pile up, the more reasonable the conclusion. Okay, so for example, if we observe a lot of people stepping out of the courthouse and then coming back and they're soaked and they got little drops of water in their clothing, or maybe we see people coming in the courthouse carrying umbrellas and they're shaking them out, we've got more pieces of evidence to show that it was raining, right? So the more cumulative the circumstantial evidence, the better the conclusion. So Wallace says, a lot of people think direct evidence is the way that you can be sure that something happened. But he said, what about cases that don't have any direct evidence connecting the suspect to the crime scene? Can you find the truth beyond a reasonable doubt when all the evidence we have is circumstantial? He gives a one-word answer: absolutely. He said jurors are instructed, don't make any distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence. He says judges will tell the jurors this, quote, both direct and circumstantial evidence are acceptable types of evidence to prove or disprove, etc., etc., etc. Neither is entitled to any greater weight than the other. He said juries make decisions about the guilt of people that are completely circumstantial cases every day. He said, I'm glad they do. Jim says all of his cold case homicides have been successfully prosecuted with nothing but circumstantial evidence. All right, so at this point, then he says, let's look at it before. Mostly this book is going to be on the Gospels, but he's going to start by coming up with circumstantial evidence for the question of God's existence. Because if there's no God, then don't worry about the New Testament, right? Don't worry about the Gospels. That's just a bunch of people that got interested in putting down some stuff that they made up. So he said the question of God's existence can be compared to a murder investigation, he says. So what we do is we assemble the circumstantial evidence, and then we ask a question. How reasonable is it that the evidence can be interpreted in any way other than to indicate this one way. So he said, how reasonable is it that there's a God? So he said, let's take a look. And he said, here are just a few evidences that there may be a God. So number one, the universe had a beginning. He says the vast majority of scientists acknowledge the universe came into being from nothing at some point in the distant past. And by the way, let me stop here for just a second. Sometimes my podcasts will spend a lot of time on a small area, like, just this, the universe had a beginning. But the one we're going to be doing today is going to be going through several pieces of evidence. We're going to accumulate them, cumulative effect. And that's going to, I think, pile up a lot of information that would be hard for somebody to argue against. They may argue against one of these, but we're going to talk about several that Jim mentions and pile those up, and you got a pretty good case for the existence of God. So we're looking at kind of the big picture today. So back to number one. What's one evidence that there may be a God? The universe had a beginning. That's the Big Bang theory. That's the standard model of cosmology. So if the universe came into existence, what began it, right? So if there's a Big Bang, there's got to be a Big Banger. What caused things to get going? You can't have things going back into infinity, right? There's got to be some kind of first cause. And since nothing else exists, this first cause has to exist outside of space, time, and matter. So what could be uncaused and yet powerful enough to bring the universe into existence? So Gottfried Leibniz said this, why is there something rather than nothing? So we think of God as a all-powerful being existing outside of space, time, and matter. And it seems the evidence, the fact that we're in a finite universe, seems to point toward the possibility that God exists. Some kind of incredibly powerful, uncaused first cause outside of space, time, and matter appears to be necessary to bring our universe into existence. So there we go. There's one piece of evidence. There may be a God because the universe had a start. There's an argument that he has here in a small section. It's called the cosmological argument. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist. Number three, therefore the universe must have a cause. Number four, this cause must be eternal and uncaused. Number five, God is the most reasonable explanation for such an uncaused first cause. So does that make sense? I think so. But remember, the key thing there is anything that begins to exist has a cause. Because some people are going to say, oh, okay, so you think God brought the universe into existence, then who brought God into existence? Right? But we're not saying anything here has to have a cause. No, anything that begins to exist has a cause. God didn't begin to exist. He's eternal. He's outside that argument. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So there's argument number one. We think there's a God because the universe had a beginning. Here's number two. We think there may be a God, Jim says, because the universe has the appearance of design, sometimes called the fine-tuning argument. There are a lot of forces, he says, in this cosmos out there that have to be calibrated to work together to make life possible. I mean, think about a bunch of dials on the wall, and they all have to be dialed to a particular number. So he just gives some examples here. The laws of electron mass, atomic mass, proton mass, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, speed of light, cosmological constant, that's how fast the universe is flying apart, gravity, mass of the universe, and many more, he said, are finely tuned for us to be here. Even inside the atom, the relationship between the protons, the neutrons, electrons has to be fine-tuned. And he quotes Stephen Hawking, who's not a believer. Here's what Hawking says. If the proton-neutron mass difference were not about twice the mass of the electron, one would not obtain the couple of hundred or so stable nucleides that make up the elements and are the basis of chemistry and biology. So Stephen Hawking says you got to have that mass difference exactly that way. So you got these cosmic forces, you got these atomic forces, and then there are specific conditions that have to be in place for a planet to support life, like the size of our Earth. It has to be exactly right. If it's too small, it loses its heat. If it's too large, it has too much water and too thick an atmosphere. So guess what? Our world is just right that way. We have to have liquid water. Our planet has to be the right distance from a star. You have to have the right kind of crust, the right kind of magnetic field, the right ratio of oxygen to nitrogen up in our atmosphere, the right kind of moon, and the right kind of star, and on and on and on. Everything seems to be organized that way. That's called the anthropic principle or anthropic argument. And here it is briefly. Number one, these physical constants and laws of the universe seem to be related exactly right to make life possible on Earth. Number two, the relationships of these laws and constants appear to be designed. Number three, a design requires an intelligent designer. Number four, God's the most reasonable explanation for that. So that's the second argument. So we got the start of the universe, we got the fine-tuning. And number three, he says, is we have a universe with complex life. Okay, so the appearance of design down to the example of biological machines on the cellular level. They're unbelievably complicated. He quotes Bill Dembski here that says the kind of complexity going on here said can't be explained by some natural law and exists in spite of the high probability that it could occur as a result of chance. And he gives just one example of this design evidence. And you can probably guess what looks designed inside of us: DNA. So science has demonstrated what is DNA. It's digital code, except it's a 4-bit code. It's not 2-bit code like our computers. It's 4-bit, right? Because it's got 4 different chemicals, bases inside the DNA structure. So DNA is specified information. It's how do you get information from intelligence? So Jim says, in the history of scientific and intellectual research, we can find no example in which information came from anything other than an intelligent source. So you've got intelligence inside of us. You've got a code inside of us. Seems to argue for God. Here's the fourth thing that he says tends to point toward the existence of God. So it's the beginning of the universe. It's the design. It's the complexity of life on the small scale and the big scale. But number 4 is we have a universe with objective morality. I mean, most of us, unless something's wrong with us, we all feel a certain obligation to moral duty. We have a sense inside of us of moral oughtness. Things that we ought to do and things we ought not do. For example, we understand it's never morally right to lie, steal, or kill for just the fun of it. These seem to be moral laws that are transcendent, in other words, beyond us. It's not a matter of subjective feeling. So no matter how you and I feel about these laws, Jim says, the truth of their status lies in the actions themselves, not our feelings about them. We can discover moral truth, but we don't invent it. So he said all moral laws that we think about in our societies come from moral lawmakers. Now, if we can think of just even one transcendent, in other words, beyond us, moral law, like it's never morally right to kill someone for the mere fun of it, there must be a transcendent moral source. And he says right now, of course, people are going to push Darwinian evolution. Well, how do we get objective moral obligations from Darwinian evolution? That's a problem. So first of all, why is that a problem? That we get morality from Darwinian evolution? No. First, if we live in a purely natural physical world, and it's just got chemical processes going in our brains, and that's what makes us do what we're doing, guess what gets tossed? Free will. That's just an illusion. And Jim says, how can I hold a murderer accountable if all that's going on is a bunch of chemical reactions in his brain? He didn't have the freedom to escape that. Here's another problem with Darwinian evolution as being the basis and the start of our moral obligations. Darwinian evolution can't produce truly objective morality. It can't. If moral truths are just human behaviors that we've created to aid our survival, then that morality is coming from us rather than having a truth claim by itself, like whether it's really morally right to kill someone for the fun of it. So if morality is just a convention of our species, he says, we better hope that the science fiction writers are wrong about the possibility of life at other places in the universe. What if they don't share that belief? Right? They come and wipe us out. Yeah, not good, huh? Pretty scary. All right, so those are the 4 things that Wallace is talking about in this section of his book. So that gives you an idea of what he's talking about there as far as circumstantial evidence. I would like to continue with this book and share the end of it with you. So I've given you part of the beginning. I've given you several podcasts of topics in the middle. I wanted to go to the last section where he says, becoming a two-decision Christian. And he said his story is that he decided to investigate the claims of Christianity, and he finally concluded that the Gospels were reliable. But now he's got a problem. He said, you can accept the historicity of the Bible and all this stuff, but he said he had such a hard time trying to decide what to do when the Gospels were talking about Jesus. Did he really demonstrate his deity? Did he really rise from the dead? Did he speak the truth about who he was, the nature of eternal life? And he said, if that's the case, he has to dump his naturalistic presuppositions. So in other words, if this world is all there is and there's no supernatural, then he's got to just say Jesus was a nice guy. And he said his concerns about the Gospels had always been rooted in those miraculous events. He said he was a philosophical naturalist. He didn't believe in miracles. But the apostles claimed they saw miracles. So he said he can still remember the day that he finally surrendered these naturalistic biases, and he moved from belief that, in other words, I do believe that Jesus lived, to belief in. Now he believes in Jesus and everything Jesus stood for. He said he remembers that day. He said he was in a church service with his wife. He said, doesn't really remember what the pastor was talking about, but he said he remembered leaning over to his wife and saying, I'm a believer. Isn't that interesting? So let me skip ahead here, because he said we should all become two-decision Christians. What does he mean? He said when he decided to believe what the gospel writers were telling him, he decided to become a Christian case maker. And he said that was just as big a decision for him as the first. He said, I began modestly. He started a small website and posted some of his own information. He became a youth pastor, gave some lessons out to the kids, started a podcast. Now he's written a book. But he said, like many Christians, when he started, he was pretty uncomfortable defending the claims of Christianity. He says, how would I ever learn enough? Don't I need a doctorate? Don't I need some major degree? Shouldn't I have read dozens of books? Don't I have to be an expert? He said, but think about jurors, right? Everything keeps coming back to the courtroom for him. He said, jurors don't need to be experts in the field under consideration. They should just be attentive and conscientious and willing to get in the game. He says that's all we need to be effective Christian case makers. We should be attentive, conscientious, and we should be willing to get in the game. He said each of us already is an expert in something. We've got life experiences that we can draw on for the expertise. We need to answer the challenges of skeptics. We can make a conscious decision to become better Christian case makers. He said that's really important. He said some of us will someday be an evangelist and we'll go all over the world. He said, okay, but that's only a few. He said all of us are called to be case makers. It's our duty as Christians. He said we've got to stop thinking of ourselves in an abbreviated manner. If we believe in Jesus, we're not just Christians, we're case-making Christians. He said we can't get comfortable and relegate the hard work of defending the faith to people who write books on the topic. He said we need to be able to prepare a defense for what we believe. He said each of us has to answer God's call on our lives as two-decision Christians. He said that's great. If you decide to believe in Jesus and follow him, that's wonderful. He said take a second step and decide to defend the Gospels and defend the things that said about Jesus there. He says become a case-making Christian in your profession. Live your life faithfully. Devote yourself to the truth. He says prepare yourself to make a defense for what you believe. He said, I encourage you, he says, to make that second decision. Start small. Nothing wrong with that. Start small. Read and study. Engage your friends. Start a blog or host a website. Volunteer to teach a class at your church. Get in the game. And that's, I think, the most powerful way to end this podcast. Get in the game. And it can be on a small scale. God will honor us for whatever we can bring as we talk to other people. We are seeing our society slip away from us. And I love the challenge that Jim Wallace gives us all. It's not enough to go to church and sing songs. That's great. That's nice to be part of a church and maybe even be in a small group. But what are we doing outside of that comfort zone? What are we doing outside of a Christian community? Where are we interacting with family and friends and coworkers and wherever it is? That's where we're going to change this society. We still can. It's pretty dark right now, but we can make a difference. Again, so this book, Cold Case Christianity, I can't tell you how highly I recommend it. If you like crime stories, by the way, I skipped over most of those, but every chapter's got a wonderful and interesting crime story. And, of course, he then relates that to Christianity. So Jim Wallace, if you can, look at his YouTube videos and just watch what he's up to. Amazing guy. Now his son, Jimmy, is helping him and getting involved as well. So I appreciate you listening today, and I hope you take on that challenge. It's a good challenge to get in the game.